Hello again and welcome to my channel for what will be a very special video for me. Today I'm going to take a break from my ongoing Zelda series and will instead be discussing another game that I hold near and dear to me. In fact, if I had a gun to my head and was forced to pick my favorite game of all time, I would probably say Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. However, if I was somehow privy to the knowledge that the gunman in question was one of those inconceivable Nintendo haters, I might then be inclined to answer with another of my favorite games, such as Bioshock. There is so much to be said about this game. You probably noticed that this video is quite lengthy. I hope that won't be a barrier to your enjoyment. I tried my best to keep my thoughts condensed, but it's difficult to hold back the flood of praise when discussing something one is extremely passionate about. While I would love for everyone to join me for the duration of this retrospective, I'm obligated to warn you that I will be analyzing the game in full, spoilers included. If you have any inclination to play Bioshock for yourself, and have mercifully gone this far without having the major beats spoiled, I urge you to not waste this chance to play it fresh. This video will still be waiting once you are ready. And to everyone else, would you kindly join me on this scenic journey through Rapture? A brief history lesson is in order before diving into the game itself. Bioshock belongs to a loose genre of video games known as immersive sims. These games are defined by unscripted gameplay that offers full agency for players to progress through carefully constructed worlds in creative ways that the developers may or may not have planned for. It's difficult to describe what makes these games special, but you know it when you see it. Some other recent titles you might recognize that adhere to this design philosophy include Dishonored, Hitman, and Deus Ex. The biggest pioneer for this style of gameplay was Looking Glass Studios. Between the Thief series and the System Shock series, they struck gold and were creating games far ahead of their time. As you could probably guess by the title, System Shock, the second game in particular, was the inspiration behind what would eventually become Bioshock. Seeing the potential this type of game commanded, a group of ex-Looking Glass devs founded their own studio, Irrational Games, in the late 90s. This is where Bioshock was born. Led by visionary and all-around legend Ken Levine, this studio set out to continue the legacy of System Shock 2 in the modern age, and the rest is history. Bioshock not only lived up to its predecessor, but very nearly completely overshadowed it. I've gabbed enough, it's time to finally dive into Bioshock itself. If you ask any player what makes Bioshock special, I can guarantee you that their response would revolve around its setting. Make no mistake, the underwater city of Rapture is the central character of the game, and is so integral to the entire experience that it is impossible to imagine Bioshock without it. System Shock 2 contained an awesomely realized setting in the Von Braun, but we've all seen spaceships before. Rapture, on the other hand, can't really be compared to any existing fictional setting. It's one of a kind. Andrew Ryan, the city's founder, can explain it far better than I.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose Rapture. A city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, Rapture can become your city as well.
That gives me chills every time. Andrew Ryan's ideals are heavily pulled from the objectivist philosophy found in Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. The book's controversial teachings essentially promote selfishness while condemning altruism. It's far from an easy read, but the Cliff Notes summary is that all of the greatest minds of society grow tired of supporting those less gifted. Having realized how much they're being held back by these parasites, the elite abandon their post and allow the world to fall to ruin. The name Andrew Ryan is even a cute little homage to Ayn Rand. After growing disillusioned with the world around him, Ryan puts his fortune into the construction of Rapture, a city on the bottom of the Atlantic. The best and brightest of the surface follow him to this capitalist utopia where they hope to prosper, free from the constraints of government, religion, or morality. Right when I used the word utopia there, you probably guessed the direction Rapture was headed. It's a funny thing how high school English class has conditioned us all to substitute the word utopia for dystopia. Before long, the cracks began to form and the grand experiment's doom was inevitable. But that all takes place before the events of Bioshock. When your player character Jack encounters the city due to a freak plane crash, it's long since fallen to ruin. As a stranger to Rapture, you are tasked with discovering what went down and surviving what you encounter within. The city doesn't take kindly to outsiders. Throughout Bioshock, the joy in uncovering the secrets and stories of Rapture and those that called it home is a primary hook. The setting is incredibly fleshed out, and new information and anecdotes are doled out at just the right pace throughout the entire game. For example, early on you are introduced to plasmids, drugs that unlock an incredible range of genetic modifications. Willfully blind to the consequences, the city shot up on the substance known as Adam to empower themselves with bona fide superpowers. From telekinesis to teleportation, nothing was off limits. But these powers came at a cost. Almost everyone left in Rapture has been reduced to shambling splicers that attack you on sight. Another awesome piece of the Rapture puzzle is the iconic Big Daddy and Little Sister dynamic. I just can't get enough of their design. Little Sisters collect the atom that powers Rapture, and therefore are hunted by any and all splicers for this sweet nectar. In order to protect the Little Sisters, Big Daddies were engineered and bonded to the sisters. These giant brutes won't attack unless provoked, but put up an incredibly fierce fight when their assigned little sister is in peril. After overcoming a Big Daddy, you are free to harvest the atom from its now defenseless little sister, or you can try to revert them back to the young girls that they originated as. As the player, the choice is up to you. Due to the underwater nature of Rapture, the city is segmented into different districts which all have an identity of their own. For example, Arcadia is an enormous undersea garden implemented as a means to supply oxygen to the city. Hephaestus utilizes the geothermal vents on the ocean floor as a source of energy. Other districts are less utilitarian, like Fort Frolic, the entertainment hub of Rapture, home to every sort of theater, mall, casino, and club. The only thing these areas have in common is a constant sense of claustrophobia, understandable when you are over 6,000 feet underwater in little more than a metal box. This prevailing claustrophobia is actually why I prefer playing at the default field of view. This narrow view is a common source of criticism, but the uncomfortable tightness of it only exacerbates the claustrophobia. The different districts serve as the levels of Bioshock. They are explored linearly, one after another. While prevailing modern game design seems to favor open-world games, the segmented progression of Bioshock allows the game to focus on smaller stories as a means of fleshing out the bigger picture. Each level is home to its own larger-than-life figures that help provide you with a glimpse of what Rapture was like before everything fell apart. And their often hostile responses give you an extremely clear view of where Rapture currently sits. While you rarely come in direct contact with any of these individuals, you learn a tremendous amount of backstory through environmental storytelling. The developers have lavishly mapped out the halls of Rapture with purposefully placed objects in order to paint a picture of the past for observant players. Couple that with the audio diaries which are carried over from System Shock 2. Hidden throughout the environments, audio diaries are a more straightforward method of allowing you access to the inner thoughts of Rapture's denizens. These are great because they play while you play, so you don't have to pause to read them. That being said, the contents of each diary are so captivating, I often find myself unable to resist taking a break from the action to better focus on what I'm hearing. Take this one, recorded the night of the Kashmir bombing that initiated the civil war that tore Rapture apart.
Another New Year's, another night alone. I'm out and you're stuck in Hephaestus, working. Imagine my surprise. I guess I'll have another drink. Here's a toast to Diane McClintock, silliest girl in Rapture. Silly enough to fall in love with Andrew Ryan. Silly enough. What happened? Oh, I'm bleeding. Oh, God. What's happening?
This is likely the first diary players encounter, and it's already setting up side characters such as Diane McClintock, a scorned lover of Ryan never seen in the actual game, but whose story is gradually uncovered through numerous diaries even beyond this first one. These fascinating stories completely capitalize on their potential for building lore, and it doesn't hurt that the vocal performances are all top-notch. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to take some time to discuss some of the more interesting characters you'll encounter. Take Dr. Steinman, for example. As a world-renowned surgeon on the surface, Steinman received a personal invitation to join Ryan and expand his craft in Rapture. He quickly found himself in a position of power as the head of the city's medical pavilion. His greatest passion was in the realm of cosmetic surgery. After all, in Rapture, even beauty is for sale. With the discovery of Adam, Steinman realized its potential to elevate his ability.
Ryan and Adam. Adam and Ryan. All those years of study, and was I ever truly a surgeon before I met them? How we plinked away with our scalpels and toy morality. Yes, we could lop a boil here and shave down a beak there, but could we really change anything? No. But Adam gives us the means to do it. And Ryan frees us from the phony ethics that held us back. Change your look, change your sex, change your race. It's yours to change. Nobody else's.
Adam turned his patient's flesh into clay in the hands of a potter. Disillusioned with simple nose jobs and the like, Steinman grew obsessed with uncovering the true beauty hidden underneath natural human anatomy. Steinman believed that better tools demanded higher standards, and, with his imagination and creativity as the only limitation, Steinman saw a higher realm of perfection. As his experiments veered further and further from the actual desires of the patients, Steinman turned to stealing cadavers and kidnapping asylum inmates as canvas for his art. By the time you arrive in Rapture, Steinman has fallen to hallucinations of the goddess Aphrodite in his insane endeavors to create a new type of beauty. The medical pavilion is one of the first levels, and is where Bioshock's inherent horror elements are at their best. The game maintains a tinge of horror throughout, but after the medical pavilion is a bit more downplayed. Due to that focus on unnerving the player, the medical pavilion and its resident mad doctor have a different feel than other sections of the game. That unique flavor is a bit of a double-edged sword because it turns Steinman into a bit of a monster of the week type deal. His level concludes with an underwhelming boss fight against the man himself, a bit fitting as most horror films seem to lose their effectiveness once the monster is finally confronted. With Steinman dead and his character fully explored this early in the game, he fails to have much of an impact in the greater narrative. It's a shame that Steinman is almost completely contained within the medical pavilion, but on the flip side, that might be the reason why his utilization is so effective and memorable within. I've already given you a glimpse of Bridget Tannenbaum, but I'd like to expand the discussion on her character in particular. See, Tannenbaum was the first to discover Adam, but was initially ridiculed for her outlandish assertions on its power. Only a smuggler named Frank Fontaine understood the value of the discovery and agreed to fund her research. Together they worked to commercialize the substance under the banner of Fontaine Futuristics. To further this end, a type of host was necessary for scaling up, and thus Tannenbaum created the Little Sisters. However, the Tannenbaum that you meet in-game is a totally different woman altogether. She grew uncomfortable with her role in all of this, especially in the mutilation of young girls to create the Little Sisters. Tannenbaum grew up in a Nazi prison camp, and when it became apparent that some part of the Little Sister retained its former identity, I think she saw a bit too much of the Nazi human experiments in her own work. Upon recanting her past convictions, she was ostracized by her partners Fontaine and Suchong, as well as the Rapture populace at large. She was declared mad and completely disappeared to a secret sanctuary where she cares her rescued little sisters and works to revert their procedures to restore the little girl within. If you make the choice to not harvest the Little Sisters, she serves as your sole legitimate ally throughout the game. On one hand, I appreciate Tannenbaum's character because she is one of the few who is able to hold on to her humanity in Rapture. Her story has a nice sense of character progression. On the other hand, I've always been bothered that the most prominent female character in a largely male-centric cast is the one to go soft. I'm not one to say it's harmful female representation, but it's certainly cliché. And with the high bar Bioshock sets for its voice actors, Tannenbaum's fake German accent stands out like a sore thumb. I mentioned Frank Fontaine in passing, but he really deserves his own discussion, as the man is second only to Ryan in terms of importance to the narrative. On the surface, Fontaine was a con man and a swindler, and none of that changed upon tricking his way into Rapture. Fontaine maintained a covert smuggling ring under the guise of his Fontaine fisheries. Even on the free markets of Rapture, certain commodities like fresh beef or real tobacco were impossible to obtain outside of smuggling operations from the surface. Other items, like Christian Bibles or films from the surface, were outlawed because they contradicted Ryan's, and therefore Rapture's, ideals. Fontaine's operations were even called upon to smuggle individuals into Rapture. At the same time, Fontaine had monopolized the plasmid market with the help of Tannenbaum's research. Ryan heaped praise upon Fontaine as a self-made man and a shining example of what Rapture stood for. That all changed once Ryan uncovered his illegal operations, as Ryan believed that Rapture's success depended on its secrecy. He feared being drawn into the events of the surface, notably the Cold War. Discovery by either side would put an end to Rapture's isolationism. Anyone risking Rapture's future predictably became public enemy number one. In order to protect his operation, Fontaine had wisely portrayed himself as a hero for the common man through manipulative, charitable acts. Fontaine was only too happy to abuse his position as the sole plasmid provider. He turned his followers into a mob imbued with superpowers and dependent only on him for their next fix. When Ryan eventually struck against Fontaine, he came across as a fascist dictator, and his people turned against him. This culminated in the civil war that turned Rapture into the dilapidated ruins you encounter in Bioshock. It's important that Fontaine's conflict with Ryan isn't a case of good versus evil. It would be so trite if Fontaine really was the virtuous opposite of Ryan that he portrays himself as. In many ways, Fontaine and Ryan were two sides of the same coin. Ryan created the exact conditions that allowed Fontaine, a man like himself, to rise, and that's exactly what happened. It's such a great case of poetic justice. Ryan does ultimately put an end to the rebellion, but it forced him to compromise his beliefs and sacrifice his city. Fontaine may have been defeated, but so was any hope for Rapture. I wanted to go into that much detail in these characters to illustrate how much depth Bioshock puts into its cast. And I didn't even get to mention everyone's favorite narcissist, Sander Cohen. These aren't cartoon characters, but are remarkably well-written and carefully constructed individuals. Each stands tall in my memory, and I hope it's the same for you. Part of that comes from the way they often play off of each other and tie into the greater narrative. While admittedly exaggerated at times, these feel like real people, and make Rapture feel like a believable place. That's something that can't be taken for granted. For all of its excellent world building and storytelling, Bioshock is still a video game at the end of the day, and a first-person shooter at that, so I think we ought to devote some time to that aspect of the game. Bioshock has a wide range of firearms available, but they are doled out slowly throughout the experience. This prevents the player from getting overwhelmed with choice, and ensures the player always has something new to try out. As is customary in games of this ilk, your first weapon is a melee one, a wrench in this case. It's important that games always provide at least one weapon that doesn't rely on any resource. You'll quickly outgrow the wrench, but it's good to know that it's always an option to finish off a weakened enemy without being wasteful. After the wrench, you receive the classic trio of pistol, machine gun, and shotgun. These are the standard set of weapons that are featured in pretty much any shooter out there, so there isn't a ton to say. The pistol has a really satisfying bang to it, and ammo is plentiful, so it's always a favorite of mine for dealing with lesser enemies. The machine gun's combination of widespread and heavy recoil makes it an unpleasant choice for me. All of Bioshock's weapons have this loose kind of feel to them. They just don't have enough weight to be as satisfying as something like a Call of Duty weapon, but the machine gun is the worst of the bunch for me. It just feels gross to use. It can be tough to resist just holding down the trigger, but smaller bursts are the most effective way to use this weapon. In contrast, the shotgun is really satisfying to use, but to be honest, it's hard to make a video game shotgun that isn't satisfying. It just comes with the territory, I guess. Its effective range is so small that it's practically another melee weapon, but one that deals one-shot death to most of its targets. Against the large hitboxes of a Big Daddy, where weapon spread and accuracy isn't as important, the shotgun and machine gun work just fine, but they do require a special approach against the smaller and more mobile splicers. I should mention that each weapon can be loaded with 3 different ammo types. For the standard weapons, this usually equates to a standard shot, an anti-personal round that deals more damage to flesh, and an armor-piercing round that works best against big daddies and security bots. In the shotgun's case, there's also a handy stun variant. Nothing too exciting with these weapons, just select the most applicable shot, assuming your ammo pool allows for it. However, the rest of the weapons are a bit more involved, and so the different types of ammo are a lot more varied. The first of these is the grenade launcher. The biggest weakness with the launcher is its slow projectile speed, the rarity of its ammo, and the potential to kill yourself in the blast. All that is a fair cost for its insane damage potential, however. Along with the stock frag, the launcher can be used to deploy proximity mines and heat-seeking RPGs. The proximity mines are best used to set up traps around choke points and then lure enemies into them. Some of the easiest Big Daddy fights are won by taunting the Tin Daddy into running through a whole line of these mines. The heat seekers can definitely be helpful, but the tracking capabilities aren't as dependable as one would hope, and they can't do anything that a skillfully launched frag could not. The next weapon is likely the most unconventional. The chemical thrower is acquired in Arcadia, and is so awkward to use that I have to force myself to pull it out whenever my ammo maxes out. The 3 ammo options either burn, freeze, or electrocute anything caught in the stream. By the time you've administered the associated status to a target, it's probably best to swap to another weapon instead of continuing to fire the chemical thrower, but this is a really cumbersome process. In addition, the chemical thrower takes an eternity to reload, and consumes ammunition at an incredible rate. When you are firing, the chemical stream obstructs your view, and forces you to be up close for an extended period. This is different from the shotgun because with that weapon you can weave in and out of range in time with its fire rate. The chemical thrower requires you to stay dangerously close for as long as you are firing. While this is a unique weapon, it's not one that I like to use. Finally, the 7th weapon available is a long-range crossbow. I love this weapon. Its bolts do so much damage that a headshot is a guaranteed kill upon any splicer in the entire game, regardless of difficulty. It's the only weapon with a zoom, so despite the bolt's travel time, it turns sniping into a viable approach. After a successful hit, the bolts have a chance to snap, but otherwise can be collected and reused, thus giving the crossbow near infinite ammunition for skilled players. It also has a very useful trap variant that can be used in a similar manner as the proximity mine, just an extremely useful and fun weapon. Guns are always your standard method of fighting back, but where in Rapture? You have to use some plasmids as well, right? Bioshock just wouldn't be complete if plasmids only existed in the game's story and enemy gallery. They need to be equipable as well. The game gives you no shortage of options for plasmids. Honestly, I think the sheer number available indicates a lack of focus. Some trimming may have been necessary. While the weapons are handed out at a nice pace that gives the player enough time to appreciate and learn each one, plasmids are handed out like candy, and often I find myself getting a new one before I can even get a chance to use the previous one. I'm definitely not going to fully explain each one in depth, but just to show the range of possibilities, I'll go through a couple. Electroshock and Incinerate apply the stun and burn status respectively, but are also important for exploration. Electroshock can be used to open malfunctioning doors, and Incinerate can be used to melt impeding ice. It's smart to give these plasmids a use outside of combat, but it's undeniably frustrating when you run into a blocked path that requires one that you don't currently have equipped. It's like in Pokemon when you need to use an HM such as Cut or Rock Smash, a move that you would never ordinarily teach to your main team. So you have no choice but to run all the way back to your PC to grab your level 7 Bidoof just for that one path. Thankfully, unlike that level 7 Bidoof, Electroshock and Incinerate are plasmids I'm perfectly happy to keep equipped. They can each hold their own in combat just fine. Another invaluable plasmid for exploration is telekinesis. This does have some use in combat, such as returning enemy projectiles or picking up corpses to use as a meat shield, but I mostly use it to grab items just out of reach. Resources can be scarce in Rapture, so being able to grab ammo or money that you might otherwise miss is reason enough to keep telekinesis permanently equipped. The last plasmid I want to highlight is Winter Blast, because it leads to an interesting risk versus reward factor in regard to resources. Winter Blast freezes an enemy in place, making the enemy easy pickings for your grenade launcher or whatever else you have handy. In Bioshock, defeated enemies generally will drop enough resources to partially replenish the resources expended during the fight. Enemies defeated while frozen do not, however. So, while Winter Blast can make difficult fights far easier to manage, It also permanently removes a small pool of resources from the game, which may make future encounters more difficult. I generally choose to avoid killing a frozen enemy unless absolutely necessary, but there are occasions where it's unavoidable. Even if you choose to never bash in a frozen enemy, it can still be used to temporarily incapacitate one to push the odds in your favor just a bit. This was just a taste of the available plasmids in the game, but in the interest of time it will have to do. They are a ton of fun to use, and even just on the surface they simply ooze flavor. Each is accompanied by a cute little 1950s style advertisement that explains its utility and never ceases to delight.
Cry out for Big Daddy's help. Make him think you're a little sister. Watch as he fights to protect you.
These do wonders in terms of tying them into the established world. I'm a sucker for first-person animations, and I think that began for me with Bioshock. Each plasmid has an awesome idle loop, like little gusts of wind circling Jack's finger with Cyclone Trap, or the bees crawling in and out of his hand for Insect Swarm. The little tastes of body horror are a great touch. At best, you can keep 6 plasmids equipped at a time, and it truly is difficult to choose which to keep on hand. There is a whole range of plasmids for crowd control, for diversion, for recruiting enemies, or just for raw damage, and each unlocks different options for combat. By choosing one plasmid, you're giving up on a whole range of others, which is what makes loadout selection so interesting. When you consider all the options available for combat, I think you end up with a really complex and creative system. It may be a bit sloppy in areas because there are so many options, but that comes with the territory. The scarcity design that permeates the game forces players to go outside of their comfort zone and experiment with all of the weapons and plasmids. The second you begin to rely on one weapon too much, you'll run out of ammo for it and have to switch to another. The game never allows you to get too comfortable with any particular strategy. Don't get me wrong, the game does encourage you to pick favorite weapons through a small number of power to the people upgrade stations, but no matter how jacked up your pistol is, you'll sometimes have to switch to something else. The fact that the game gives you access to every weapon, all at once, each with 3 ammo types, is honestly pretty overwhelming. When playing on a PC, you'll have the whole number row assigned to weapon selection, so you can switch between them instantly provided your fingers are nimble enough. It's a little different on console, where you have to briefly pause to open this weapon selection wheel. You still have quick access to every weapon, it's just a bit more jarring. I used the word creative to describe the combat in Bioshock just a minute ago. I know you're probably tired of hearing about the weapons and plasmids, but bear with me because this is where it gets really interesting. There are a bunch of really neat techniques that are only uncovered through experimentation, or me explaining them to you right now. Plasmids, weapons, and the combinations of the two react in very predictable ways. If you can envision some cool use for them, it probably plays out in-game the same way it did in your head. A simple example that the game explains to you is that using Electro Bolt on a pool of water, quite plentiful in a setting like this, will electrocute every enemy in it all at once. You can even combine Incinerate with this technique. Light up a group of enemies to send them all running for water, then zap the lot of them when they find it. A bit of a more complicated technique involves covering some in-game prop with proximity mines, and then using telekinesis to hurl the Mega Bomb at a Big Daddy to take him out in one shot. The game rewards this type of experimentation, not to mention it's way more fun to play outside the box in this way. My biggest issue with the combat is the lack of consequences for death. Bioshock makes use of what are called Vita Chambers to respawn you anytime you fall in battle. It's cool that there is an in-universe explanation, but the system is way too forgiving. You return with half of your life remaining and your wallet just a bit lighter, but all of the damage you dealt before death remains. This crucial detail makes kamikaze bum rushes a valid strategy, and I hate that about it. The rest of the combat system is so well constructed, but that one decision can render it all meaningless if you let it. Once you realize that dying doesn't matter, the only thing holding you to a careful and thoughtful approach to combat is your own respect for yourself and the intended playstyle. It is possible to disable Vita Chambers, but this forces you to be constantly saving and reloading whenever a mistake is made. More frustrating than fun in my opinion. Even though I've just let the cat out of the bag, I urge you to forget everything I just said. It's way more rewarding to play as if death does carry an appropriate punishment. I just wish the game itself realized that. In the 2000s, there was a lot of talk about the consolification of games. Essentially, the claim was that the popularity of the 6th and 7th generation of consoles enticed formerly PC-centric developers to bring their games over to this new market. In doing so, the design of ported games was simplified, both out of hardware necessity and to better appeal to the masses. Our most beloved Bioshock was one of the biggest targets of these claims. How do I feel about this? While Bioshock inarguably belongs in the same lineage as System Shock 2, it's also true that many of System Shock 2's systems were left in the dust to make the game more palatable. I wouldn't argue with that. I have to ask though, was anything meaningful really lost in the conversion? Gone is the tedious drag-and-drop inventory management. Weapons no longer randomly jam. The hard stat locks to use certain weapons or abilities are no more. Did any of these really add to the experience? System Shock 2 inarguably has more systems to manage, but does that make it a better game? I can easily imagine a hypothetical Bioshock with all of those extra complexities reinstated, but I prefer the version we got. I'd argue that if there isn't a tangible benefit to a system's inclusion, it shouldn't be included just for the sake of it. Bioshock isn't so much a simplified System Shock 2, but a streamlined one, and is all the stronger for it. The developers of Bioshock were very intentional with what was carried over and what was cut. They hit a nearly perfect balance of satisfying depth and accessible ease of use. I say nearly because there are just a few instances where I don't think they went far enough in streamlining. For example, late in the game, Bioshock introduces a crafting system called U-Invent. Players can use these stations to convert junk found in-game into something more useful, like ammunition. This is such a shallow system that I'm surprised it was tacked on. Outside of the plot beat where it is introduced, players can easily ignore the entire thing without compromising their experience in any discernible way. Ammo will just be a little bit tighter. The crafting system was probably added last minute to bring the game more in line with its predecessor, but it doesn't reach deep enough into the game's DNA to add any meaningful depth. I'm probably preaching to the choir with this next bit, but I can't just skip over it. I really don't like the version of hacking found in this game. Anytime you encounter a security bot, a camera, a turret, or a vending machine, you're given the opportunity to hack it. This will either turn the machine to your side in the case of security machines, or will just reduce the prices of vending machines. It would be wasteful to not hack each vending machine before use, so I go through the trouble to hack them, but it's oh so tedious. The game grinds to a screeching halt and forces you to play this infuriating pipe dream minigame, and I'd like to take a second to rant about this stupid thing. You basically just need to line up a path for the water before the flow catches up to you. I can't remember back to my thoughts the first time I encountered it, but I doubt it was fun even then. When the game asks you to do this hundreds of times throughout your playthrough, it quickly becomes unbearable. The most frustrating thing about it is that, without certain tonics equipped, you'll often run into layouts which are just straight up impossible. I don't mean that the water flow is too fast to keep up with. I mean, even with superhuman APM, there is no solution. The hacking minigame is an abomination that actively makes me not want to engage with the hacking aspects of this game at all. But that's not the only reason I don't like Bioshock's implementation of hacking. My problem is that hacking in combat is more trouble than it's worth. It takes so much time to skulk about and turn all the security system to your side, but the reward for doing so just isn't worth it. It's way less hassle to just use your guns and plasmids. Even if you hack everything, you'll still have to rely on your guns and plasmids at the end of the day, so why even bother? Systems like hacking and stealth aren't fleshed out enough to be an alternative to combat, and hacking in particular takes so much work that I have to force myself to engage with it. For hacking or stealth to be a true alternative to combat, I think Bioshock would have to be reworked to encourage more intentional specialization. Bioshock isn't quite like other games like Dishonored, where you're given a range of options for completing your objectives. Say you need to enter a locked room. You might be able to pick the lock, or maybe you could use your superior maneuverability to find an alternate entry point. Perhaps you find the guard and are able to sweet-talk the keys off of him. Regardless of which you chose, you probably had to specialize in some skill in order to bypass the lock. By investing in one skill, you are giving up on others, but that is what makes choices meaningful and allows the player to own their experience. Bioshock isn't like that. Combat is generally the only way to advance. Tonics do allow some shallow player customization into something like stealth or hacking, but it's never a primary path to progression. The biggest effect any amount of specialization has in Bioshock is in nudging the player to approach combat in a slightly different way. There is never a figurative or literal door closed to the player because they didn't invest in a particular skill. A player could never complete the entire game by relying exclusively on hacking. and even if they did fully invest in hacking, the only benefit they would receive is a bit less annoyance when prepping machines before a combat encounter. It would be great if there were different pathways and consequently unique rewards open only to players who invested in hacking. As is, all avenues are always open to all players, so there is little reason to specialize in anything. I hate to make this pun, but Bioshock wants you to play as a jack of all trades, which makes me wonder what the game would be like if this wasn't the case. No discussion on Bioshock would be complete without delving into the famous twist, but before I do so I wanted to give one last warning. I've saved discussion about the central spoiler until now, just in case this video has changed your mind and made you want to play the game for yourself. If what you've seen and heard thus far was enticing to you, go and experience the title properly. Video games are meant to be played. You won't get anything close to the full effect by listening to me blather on and on without having played it for yourself. Consider this your final warning. The gloves are coming off. Ever since you mysteriously arrived in Rapture, a freedom fighter named Atlas has been helping you make your way to confront the big man, Andrew Ryan himself. When you finally reach his office, everything is revealed. I'll just let it play out.
The assassin has overcome my final defense, and now he's come to murder me. In the end, what separates a man from a slave? Money? Power? No. A man chooses. A slave obeys. You think you have memories. A farm. A family. An airplane. A crash. And then this place. Was there really a family? Did that airplane crash? Or was it hijacked? Forced down. Forced down by something less than a man, something bred to sleepwalk through life until they are activated by a simple phrase spoken by their kindly master. Was a man sent to kill, or a slave? A man chooses. A slave obeys. Come in. Stop, would you kindly? Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find it? Would you kindly find it? Would you kindly get this thing? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
Sit, would you kindly? Stand, would you kindly? Run! Stop! Turn. A man chooses. A slave obeys. Kill! A man chooses. A slave obeys. Obey!
Okay, I'm back. Hope you didn't miss me too much. I struggled with the decision to let that whole sequence play out, but it's so crucial to the game's story that I couldn't help myself. If you didn't catch everything, I'll give it a brief summary. The fellow on your radio was never on your side. Atlas is actually the same Frank Fontaine I discussed earlier. He faked his death in order to get a second chance at taking down Ryan. In order to do that, he commissioned a trump card. You. The artificially grown offspring of Ryan's DNA would be able to navigate Rapture like no other. In order to move Jack like a pawn, Fontaine had him conditioned with the mind-controlled trigger phrase, "Would you kindly?" During your first playthrough, you may have just passed it off as a peculiar manner of speech, but Atlas has been directing your every move with this phrase since before you even set foot in Rapture. The best narrative twists are the ones that completely recontextualize everything preceding, while still making narrative sense. Bioshock absolutely scores on both of those fronts. I wish I could go back to my first playthrough so I could experience the mind-blowing reveal again, but alas. It feels earned too. There are many hints leading up to the full reveal that might lead clever players to figure it out early. One of those hints has been right in front of you the entire game, Jack's wrist tattoos. While the "would you kindly" beat is shocking enough within the confines of the story, it's even cooler when you think of it as a meta-criticism on video games themselves. Just as your character lacked free will, so too do you the player. We grow so accustomed to the structure of game design that it's easy to forget how little freedom we are really given. Even in a relatively open-ended immersive sim, you still are forced to play through the experience the way Bioshock wants you to. There is no room to break the rules that the game forces you to abide by. When you consider video games in this light, the developers are the only ones with real agency, because they make the rules. Bioshock posits that the purported interactivity of video games is a facade for what is just a more masked, directed experience. Or I'm digging way too deep into it. You be the judge. I know that when I first played Bioshock, I fully expected the confrontation with Ryan to be the end of the game, but I was mistaken. When Fontaine reveals himself to be the real villain of the game, and shows all of his cards, there are still several hours left to get through. Unfortunately, it's a pretty steep decline in quality from this point on. I am glad that Bioshock has more to give, but nothing in the rest of the game holds up to this moment. The Fontaine twist is great, but suffers from lost momentum with the absence of Ryan's looming shadow in the latter parts of the game. In what I assume is an attempt to keep the game feeling fresh, Bioshock falls to gimmicky gameplay in its final levels. Fontaine's residual conditioning leads you to lose control of your active plasmid for a stretch. I understand the developer's intent with taking away player agency in combat. They wanted to enforce the "a man chooses, a slave obeys" mantra, but it lasts way too long and is an annoyance more than anything. In Point Prometheus, you are tasked with collecting the components necessary in order to pull off a Big Daddy disguise. This is actually a strong level with a cool setting and interesting layout, but what follows after you enter the Big Daddy suit is the game's low point. In the Proving Grounds, the game turns into a stop-and-go escort mission where you're forced to protect the little sister as you walk down a completely linear hallway and fight off repeated ambushes. The added concern of keeping the little sister alive could have been interesting, but that potential wasn't realized. The enemy encounters feel so artificial and fail to really change the game. It's just a cycle of fight enemies, wait for sister to catch up, fight enemies, wait for sister to catch up, and repeat. There must be a mod or something to speed these things up. Throughout this entire ordeal, you have this cheap-looking diving helmet overlay taking up half of your screen, just in case you forgot the obvious gimmick of the level. Eventually you can train yourself to block it out, but until that point it's so obnoxious. The actual layout of the level is without question the most linear and bland in the entire game. There really isn't anything redeeming about the Proving Grounds. The final level is a boss fight against a spliced-up Fontaine. You've been watching this video for quite some time now, so you can probably answer this for yourself. Does Bioshock feel like the type of game that needs a boss fight? I can't overstate how incongruent this fight feels to everything that's preceded it. An old school style boss fight just doesn't fit in a game like this. It isn't even a well-designed or interesting fight either. 3 phases of a monstrous Fontaine throwing elemental projectiles at you or throwing himself at you in a charge attack. There are a couple security bots and splicers introduced to keep you on your toes, but that's it. Turning your previously well-written antagonist into a hulking brute spouting nothing but groans and one-liners is such a strange decision and totally kills any chance of ending on a high note. Another great game that released in the late aughts, Arkham Asylum, ends in a similarly disappointing way, and I really don't know what these studios were thinking. There are a few more contemporary games that followed this baffling trend, but I don't want to spoil a bunch of games unnecessarily, even if they are a decade old. Is this a publisher-mandated decision? Were they looking to satisfy players' expectations of a climactic face-off with the big bad? It's so frustrating when a smart game turns dumb at the last second for inexplicable reasons. There is one last cutscene presented after Fontaine is defeated, one last chance to redeem the game, and it's completely wasted. As you play, Bioshock keeps track of how you dealt with the little sisters. Did you harvest or save them? Then it does some complex calculus behind the scenes to determine if you're a good person or a bad person. If you harvested more than one sister, you get the bad ending, and otherwise you get the good one. At least they allow you to satisfy your curiosity with one harvest before deeming you evil. The good ending sees you reject dominion over Rapture to instead raise the little sisters as adopted daughters. The bad ending sees you harvest all of the sisters, take over the city, and then rise to the surface to lead a nuclear war. These two endings are so black and white it's hilarious. The player who harvested just one little sister is portrayed as Mother Teresa, while the player who harvested one additional sister beyond that is literal Hitler reincarnated. The morality is so forced that neither is a satisfying ending. Then the cutscene abruptly ends and you're shot back to the main menu. No credits, nothing. I can't imagine a more anticlimactic way to end such an otherwise excellent game. As bad as Bioshock's ending is, it at least blows System Shock 2's out of the water. I'll let you look that one up for yourself. I opened this video declaring that Bioshock is in the shortlist for my favorite game of all time. And let me tell you, I play no small number of games, so that's quite the commendation. I really didn't want to end this video on a negative note, but I did exactly that, so I hope to correct it now. Bioshock is a peerless game that did more to advance storytelling in the medium than almost any other. It's a wild success in almost every facet of game design, which is what makes it so frustrating when it stumbles. No game is perfect, and when you zoom out, the faults are easy to forgive and fail to tarnish the overall package. I won't hesitate to complain about certain elements of the game, but I don't want my quibbles to distract from the true greatness of Bioshock. I've made many trips to Rapture over the years, and I cherish each one, but that first playthrough still stands out in my memories. I was completely immersed in the game's world. It was unlike anything I had ever played before. I'm willing to bet many players reacted similarly. Simply put, there really isn't anything else quite like Bioshock. If you've made it to the end, well, I'm flattered you would choose to spend your precious time listening to me. Thanks for giving me a chance. This video was a lot of work to put together, but it was fueled by love for a deserving masterpiece. I hope that some of my passion for this game spread through it to you. I look forward to hearing about your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Until then, this is Austin Ashworth signing off.